Professor Patrick Loch Otieno Lumumba, a Kenyan lawyer, orator, and Pan-Africanist, has expressed strong support for the BRICS alliance, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and its potential role in reshaping global power dynamics. Watch and pay attention.
The for the moment is that BRICS is such an organization. Whether that is true or not is something that we will debate a little later. But it must not be lost on us that even BRICS, as presently constituted, has leadership. And that leadership appears to come from China, it appears to come from Russia, and it appears to come from India, and it appears to come from Brazil and South Africa to a limited extent. But one hopes that when other countries come from Africa, they will negotiate their way in a manner that will give them the foothold that they deserve. That, I think, is the reason why African countries are beginning to warm up to BRICS. At a personal level, I'm very worried about African countries individually joining these institutions because they'll be outmaneuvered and outflanked. My desire, if I was asked, is that African countries operating under the aegis of the African Union is the body that should, in fact, be present at BRICS. In that way, you then don't have to isolate South Africa, Algeria, Ethiopia, and deal with them independently. But you deal with the African Union as a union comprising 54 countries. And why does that make more sense to me? It makes more sense to me because African Union is now trying to give practical meaning to Africa Agenda 2063. African Union is trying to implement the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. And for us as a continent, therefore, to speak with one voice, we are safer moving in as African Union with a declared continental agenda, which will then be the agenda that is taken to the BRICS. But as it is, individual countries are getting into BRICS with the consequence that the African countries which are not members will once again feel that they are not part of the party. And that, to me, is undesirable. Take an example. If you are dealing with the countries which are the prime movers of BRICS, like China, you are talking about an economy that is in excess of 10 trillion. You are talking about Brazil, whose economy is in excess of 2 trillion. You are talking about India, whose economy is in excess of nearly 4 trillion United States dollars, and all these figures are in dollars. Look at the largest African economy, Ghana, or rather Nigeria, which has a GDP of slightly above 500 billion United States dollars. Look at Egypt, which is just about 400 billion, and South Africa, about 450 billion United States dollars. You can see that the combined economy of all African countries, give or take, is smaller than the economy of India. So it makes sense for the continent for the moment to go there with a continental voice. And in that way, their presence at the BRICS will be that much more respected. And very lastly, when you are dealing with African countries, you are dealing with countries with a minimum of 33 currencies. And you are going into an environment where you will be dealing with India with a rupee. You will be dealing with China with a yuan. You'll be dealing with Russia with a ruble. So you have 33 currencies. How are you going to fit them in? So we've got to re-examine some of these engagements, and it is incumbent upon Africa and Africans and African countries to really take stock of the history of how they have been shortchanged and let that history inform current action for the benefit of this generation and generations yet to be born. When we talk about decolonization, and decoloniality. And I like to make the distinction. Decolonization was the experience of having political independence. And that we know, we now have our own political independence to the extent that you can describe it as independent. But decoloniality is a different ballgame, is the next step of having to ensure that we liberate ourselves from the shackles of colonialism, including the economic order, sometimes even political order, and even cultural order that was imposed by the colonial project. And that said, even when we talk about African solutions to African problems, we are not naive to assume that Africa will now divorce herself from the rest of the world. We are simply saying that Africa must cooperate with the rest of the world from a position of strength, not from a position of weakness. And this is something that Africa has recognized from 1963. If you listen to the position that were taken by Africans of that day, people like Nkrumah, people like Gamal Abdel Nasser, or Kwame, or rather Nyerere of Tanzania, they were saying that it is important that we create institutions that are going to enable us to engage from a position of strength. And if that is the case, the question is, how are we doing it as we speak? We realize, and this was evident in the conversation that took place in Lagos in 1980 under the Lagos Plan of Action, Africans recognized that amongst ourselves, we don't trade. We don't add value to our goods. If you look at intra-African trade now, it is below 20%, the lowest anywhere in the world. Yet potentially, we have a market of nearly 1.5 billion peoples. So we are saying that it is an organized Africa, organized as contemplated under the Lagos Plan of Action, organized as contemplated under Africa Agenda 2063 and Africa Continental Free Trade Area, that is then ready to engage the world. So that when they engage the world, they are engaging the world from a position of strength. When they are in BRICS, then they are doing so in a manner that enables them to speak at the same level with Brazil, with Russia, with China, and of course with India. And it is a partnership of equals. Otherwise, if Africa is weak, her relationship is like the relationship between a horse and the rider. And in my metaphor, Africa will be the horse and the others will be the riders. And it is something that is desirable, and I do not understand even BRICS to be saying we are not going to work with the United States of America. We are not going to work with Europe. We are going to work with everybody in the world, but from a position of mutual respect and strength for mutual benefit, so that the relationship will be symbiotic rather than parasitic. And Africa has been beaten times without number, but somehow she's never shy. She still enters into traps which are so very obvious, which is what we must avoid if we are not to be eaten for breakfast by other civilizations. Russia, China, India, and of course Brazil are emerging markets. But they are emerging markets in the context of a world which is still in many ways dominated by the conceptual West. So there are certain technologies which, for example, Russia has, which we need, which the conceptual West is unwilling to give to Africa. If you look at the energy sector, for example, we need nuclear technology in order to use nuclear technology for power generation. If you go to any typical Western country, they will never, ever share that kind of technology with any African country. But if Russia is prepared to collaborate with the African continent to offer technology and to transfer that technology so that we can generate power and move into the path of industrialization. If you look at the area of agriculture, for example, I believe that it is necessary that we collaborate with countries, including Russia, China, and India, because Russia, for example, is very strong in the area of fertilizers. How can and non-organic seeds? How can we collaborate with Russia in that regard? And one is also talking about mining technology. We know that quite a number of African countries are involved in the mining sector. How are we going to collaborate in that sector? And my counsel to African countries is that as we are collaborating, we must look at what is in our best interest. In other words, our relationship with Russia must be defined in a manner that is beneficial to us, and Russia must also define what is beneficial to them, and we meet in the middle. Since African countries started engaging with the IMF and the World Bank, they have prescribed many solutions to our problem. The most prominent of the solutions that were prescribed by IMF and World Bank was what was described in the 1980s as the structural adjustment programs. Almost all African countries, I think excluding Eritrea, which came about in 1991, and Botswana, was subjected to these structural problems. And of course, South Africa, which had not regained our independence from the apartheid movement. All countries went through these, and we thought that we were emerging. They were telling us, denationalize your institutions, sell all assets, remove government from what is business or quasi-business. Several years down the line, if the measure of those success is the quality of people's lives, not statistics, not GDP, not GDP per capita, not statistics, quality of people's lives. Are Africans the better after that? The answer is no. Have we addressed the critical issue of critical problems of poverty and disease in many African countries? Have we ensured that our manufacturing sectors are thriving? Do we have sufficient power generation in most of Africa? The answer is no. We have become more dependent on Western institutions, and you've seen a number of economies in Africa having currencies that cannot withstand the barrage of blows from the West, and some countries have had to dollarize their economies. We have seen Zimbabwe dollarize their economy because of sanctions. We have seen certain countries informally dollarize their currencies or their economies. These IMF, World Bank, and therefore Bretton Woods prescriptions are not and were never designed to liberate Africa economically, which then begs the question, what will BRICS do that is different? The answer is, we as Africans and African countries must be in there so that in the early formative stages, they are able to learn from the lessons of the past to ensure that they are not dealt with in the manner that the IMF and the World Banks have dealt with them. BRICS must ensure that its agenda is an agenda that is going to liberate African countries economically. And I'm prepared to embrace BRICS because the Chinese have a story to tell within BRICS. They can tell us how within 30 years they have succeeded in lifting nearly 800 million people out of poverty, how they have succeeded in industrializing. If they tell that story within BRICS, it is a good story which we can also adopt and adapt. India has a story to tell. They too have been lifted nearly 500 million people out of poverty and is work in progress. Brazil has a story to tell. And I think those stories are the stories that we need to hear within the continent of Africa, and not hear, but to learn from, and not just learn from, but use the lessons to liberate Africa.
Here are some of his key perspectives on BRICS and its relevance to Africa. 1. A challenge to Western dominance. Lumumba viewed BRICS as a crucial counterbalance to Western-led global institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. He believed that BRICS offers a path for countries to bypass traditional Western financial systems, which he criticized for imposing exploitative policies and creating debt dependency in the global south. According to Lumumba, BRICS provide a unique platform for Africa and other developing regions to pursue a more self-reliant model of development, free from the historical influence of Western powers. 2. Opportunities for Africa's economic growth. Lumumba is optimistic about Africa's potential economic benefit from deeper engagement with BRICS. He highlights the economic opportunities for African countries to gain access into financing, infrastructure investment, and trade partnerships. Lumumba has praised initiatives like the BRICS New Development Bank (NDB), which finances infrastructure and development projects and could be an alternative source of funds for African nations that are usually constrained by the stringent conditions of Western financial institutions. 3. Advancement of a multipolar world order. Lumumba supports BRICS as a step toward creating a multipolar world, where power is more equitably distributed across regions rather than being concentrated in the West. He believed that the rise of BRICS can strengthen Africans' voice in global politics by empowering countries to negotiate better terms and defend their interests on the international stage. The multipolar structure, he argues, could create a more balanced and inclusive world order that respects the sovereignty and aspiration of developing countries. 4. Promoting South-South cooperation. Lumumba sees BRICS as an embodiment of South-South cooperation, encouraging solidarity among countries in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. He believes that BRICS can help foster collaboration among developing nations by building partnerships that focus on mutual benefits rather than exploitation. Through BRICS, Lumumba envisions a future where African countries collaborate with other nations on technology transfer, capacity building, and resource sharing in ways that prioritize African development needs. And lastly, an alternative economic and political mode. Lumumba is critical of Western capitalists and neoliberal modes that he believes have often led to inequality and dependency in African countries. He supports BRICS as a potential platform for exploring alternative development modes that do not necessarily mirror Western capitalism. He suggests that BRICS countries can help African nations develop frameworks that prioritize local industries, reduce reliance on foreign aid, and promote sustainable development based on the unique needs and values of each nation. And there you have it, guys. Kindly like and share your thoughts in the comment box below. Until next time, cheers and have a good one.